What are gender responsive policies and why do they matter? Well, this is what we're going to be talking about today on this channel. Hi, my name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. So let's get into it. So today we are going to be taking a gendered perspective on migration policies. And if you want to know more just about migration and gender and how gender can affect a lot of things having to do with migration, of course, please check out my video on that. I'll make sure to link it in the description below. But now let's look at why a gender perspective in migration policies even matters. So there are a number of reasons for this and a number of reasons why we should actually care. We know that migration is shaped by gender at every stage. Again, go back to my previous video on that. From reasons for departure, to integration, to return, to the type of work that is performed by migrants, and the challenges that they face. And laws and policies often reproduce existing gender inequalities across countries of origin, transit, and destination. And policies that ignore gender differences can seem fair on the surface, but actually can lead to bias and discrimination in the short, medium, or longer term. So gender-neutral frameworks often fail to consider the specific needs and realities of men, women, boys, girls, and also non-binary individuals. So a gender-responsive approach actively addresses discrimination and ensures that no group is favored or excluded. So migration policies are never gender neutral in their effect. So let's look at a continuum of some of these different types of gender approaches, from the most responsive to things that are more gendered biased. So let's look at this spectrum, starting with gender responsive policies. So these respond to specific needs of all migrants. They address structural causes of gender discrimination in migration, and they transform systems, norms, policies, and structures. Now, gender-specific approaches focus on women migrants or migrants of diverse genders. They often address some gender inequalities, but not structural ones. Gender-sensitive policies or approaches acknowledge but do not specifically address gender inequalities. Gender-blind policies appear unbiased but actually reinforce gender inequalities. They can often produce uneven outcomes for women or men and gender-diverse individuals. And then finally, we have actually gender-biased approaches or policies, and these actually discriminate or exclude genders, and they produce negative impacts on women, men, and gender-diverse individuals. Now, another way that we can look at this is looking at gender-biased, gender-neutral, and gender-responsive policies. So let's go through each of these. So a gender-biased policy is a policy that directly discriminates amongst gender lines. And here we see policies that restrict access to migration programs based on gender or gender identity. A gender-neutral program or policy is a policy that needs to have the same impact on men, women, boys, girls, and non-binary individuals, yet fails to address, gender-specific needs and circumstances. So the outcomes of gender-neutral policies can still be detrimental on the basis of gender or gender identity. Now, gender-responsive policies are policies that address any normative biases and discrimination on the basis of gender and gender identity. So policies that address representation, decision-making, and distribution of resources between men, women, boys, girls, and non-binary individuals are what we generally see here. And these policies are based on often sex disaggregated data. So let me give you a few examples of these types of policies. Gender-biased policies explicitly discriminate or often control women's mobility based on traditional gender norms and enable their systematic exploitation. For example, there have been bans in the Indian context on women under 30 from migrating for work to certain countries, reinforcing the idea that young, less educated women are naturally, in quotations, more vulnerable and need state protection and therefore should not be allowed to do this specific thing. In the Sri Lankan context, the Family Background Report there actually restricts women's migration based on their marital and caregiving roles and requires spousal consent and inspection of family well-being. So you can see that this is again very strongly restrictive towards women. In Indonesia, we see that policies have at times required male guardians' approval for women to migrate as domestic workers. So in many of these cases where we see these very specific restrictions, it's often restrictions on women or certain groups or categories of women to be able to migrate, often for domestic work and often in a Middle Eastern context. Let's talk about gender-neutral policies then. So these gender-neutral policies aim to treat all individuals equally. So of course that is the idea of them, but they often fail to address specific gender-related needs and challenges, often leading to harmful outcomes because they ignore structural inequalities. So they're often written in good faith, but these gender-neutral laws often result in gender-biased outcomes. So let me give you an example here. So family-based immigration systems may appear gender-neutral, but disproportionately affect women, who often depend on a male relative for sponsorship. Approximately 70% of immigrant women gain legal status through dependent pathways. So a family-based scheme can be officially the same for everyone. So men can bring their wives over, women can bring their husbands over. But what we see is that these types of policies are often used much more by one gender than the other. So in this case, it is more common that the man is migrating and then the female spouse is joining them. So it's a gender-neutral policy, but we see that it is generally used more by specific genders. So let's talk then about these gender-responsive policies. So gender-responsive migration policies and governance acknowledge the diverse and intersecting realities migrants face due to gender, sex, age, sexual orientation, identity, or race, and try to ensure that rights are upheld and equality is promoted. Now, gender-responsive policies are built on often sex-disaggregated data and actively work to eliminate normative biases and structural discrimination in this area. So gender-responsive policies is more than just comparing men and women statistically. It involves addressing specific needs like access to sanitary care or protection from gender-based violence and safe working conditions. So effective migration policy and governance here must embed gender at all levels and stages of migration, from departure to return, also while ensuring policy alignment across national and local levels to try to provide support on the ground and not just at a more macro level. So for this to work well, comparative institutional efforts are generally needed to develop gender-responsive policies tailored to women and girls, but also sometimes it's needed also for men and boys. This should be informed by our Sustainable Development Goal 5 on gender, and we also have it embedded in the International Migration Compacts. All right, so how can we inform gender-responsive policies in the first place? Well, this of course does take a lot more effort, a lot more capacity, and often also more resources. So at the onset, we need to engage all relevant actors by creating cross-ministerial and multi-stakeholder platforms to, guide the full cycle of migration policy, from identifying the issue to designing, implementing, and evaluating interventions. You need to clearly determine the migration challenge being addressed and define who the policy is intended to support with intention to gender and intersecting identities. You need to establish clear commitment to embed gender equality and human rights principles into the foundation of the policy. So that is from the very beginning. Now, you want to also do some gendered analysis by examining existing gender dynamics, ensuring inclusive participation, identifying gender-based disparities that might be an issue in that context, and document all of these, kind of key observations in a specific space or in a specific policy context. So you want to also remain aware of underreporting, particularly in cases of discrimination affecting, for example, LGBTQI individuals. You want to investigate the root causes and potential impacts of identifying gendered patterns, including those shaped by existing policies, and to evaluate the influence of gender norms, such as whether men are more encouraged to take on leadership roles or not. And assess how these patterns affect equitable access to opportunities, resources, and representation in the policy arena. Of course, then you can go on to do gender impact assessment. You can also then look at your findings and try to find room for improvement. I think there is a lot that can still be done here, and we can do more to have gender responsive policies in place. Of course, once we have policies in place, then there is the implementation of these policies. And implementing gender responsive policies in migration really often requires institutional change, including the creation of dedicated gender units and mandatory capacity building for public officials. Sometimes you need gender training, gender responsive budgeting, and then of course there needs to be very clear accountability across all of the stakeholders for these to work properly. Of course, we can go much more into these different areas, but I wanted to just give you a quick understanding of why gender responsive policies even make sense, why this is relevant, the different types of policies that we can have from a gendered perspective, and then what we need to build good gender responsive policies. So I hope this gave you a good idea of all of those things. If you have some experience with this, feel free to comment down below. Let us know also your own experiences with these things. If you found this video useful, of course, as usual, like it, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the videos that we upload on a regular basis on this channel. And I do hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.